Welcome to class. I'm so excited today because today we're doing pivot tables. Download the University Crime data set, and that is what we're going to work with. Today, University Crime, XLSM, beautiful. We'll save that and open it up. All right. How many of you think, you know what, I'm pretty comfortable with pivot tables? Just show a hand, just not using VBA in pivot tables, but just pivot tables. And how many of you are going, you know, I'm not so comfortable with pivot tables? Okay, so that's a few of us saying we're not comfortable, and most of us saying, yeah, we're pretty comfortable with it. We go back only about 5 years, and those numbers were just reversed. So sounds like pivot tables are becoming a little bit better known. That's great. The whole idea behind a pivot table is to be able to summarize data across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Pick 2 or 3 dimensions and be able to say, I want to summarize all these numbers. Back in the early days of Excel, you wanted to know how many, what do we have here? How many assaults there were in the state of Alabama during the year of 2010. You kind of had to either filter the data or just sort the data so you could go figure that out. But now the whole pivot table will do that for us. So our goal then today is to see how to automate pivot tables. We're going to start off, for those of us who are still pretty uncomfortable with pivot tables, we'll make a pivot table or two, talk about it, see what we can do with it, and then we'll switch over to recording ourselves doing it and then coding it up from scratch. And so this data, this kind of interesting data, it's well formed for a pivot table because what we have is we have a single numeric value on each line, and then we have lots of other columns that just give this context. So if I look at this number right here, that number 28 means, well, those are burglaries. Those are crimes rather than information. These are burglaries that happened on the Jacksonville State University campus in Alabama in the year 2006. So that's what this data is. Any questions? Well, let's go ahead and learn how to do pivot tables then. So pivot tables are on the Insert tab. It's the first time I tried to find pivot tables. Once they put the ribbon, of course the ribbon came in 2007. For most of you, that's probably how you learned Excel, was with the ribbon. But I started looking for the pivot table. Where'd they move the pivot table command to? And for some reason, I thought more advanced commands would be further to the right. I must have spent an hour looking for the pivot table command. It is the very first command on the Insert menu. So there it is, pivot table. So I'm going to select that. It's going to know that I can't make a pivot table on a single cell, which I had selected, so it'll expand the selection to the current region, the set of contiguous data, and I'm going to go ahead and leave the defaults here to put it onto a new worksheet, and we'll say OK. I remember the first time I ever made a pivot table was probably 1997, maybe 1999, somewhere in the late 90s. And you know, pivot tables were new and exciting in Excel. I'd read some article about them, and I thought, oh, those sound pretty interesting. I should learn about pivot tables. I didn't have any data need that I was trying to solve. It was just, oh, here's a tool I should learn about. And I got this far. In fact, I don't even think it brought up this back in the day. It just kind of came here. And it was like, here's your pivot table. And I looked at it, and I right-clicked for a while and couldn't figure anything out. And I gave up. You know, I didn't ever make a pivot table that year. It was, years later. Never made a pivot table. OK. So now I forgot, field list. I'm going to show my field list over here so I can get that list back. And so I always, when I'm making a pivot table, I always start with what I'm trying to summarize. And so in this case, it's easy because all I have is this thing called value. So I'm going to drag value down here to my values column, my values area. And that's now giving me the sum. It's just summed up that whole column. Whatever that is, in fact, what does that number mean? What's that? Yeah, what does it mean? Any idea? Yeah. That's exactly what it is. But what does it mean? What does that number mean? Now, tell me what. Okay, so the answer is absolutely nothing. Why does it mean absolutely nothing? Well, it's not summing years because I think I'm summing the value. So I've got years over here in column A, but the value over here is what I'm summing. So it's the sum of everything in column G. Now, if this number enrollment wasn't here, because I've got either a type that's either crime or information. So it happens that I know in this data I've got the enrollment for Auburn University in 2006. And if that number wasn't there, if it was just the rest of them summed up, that would be somewhat meaningful, right? That is the total number of, would be the total number of crimes known to law enforcement that happened on university campuses during this data set period, whichever it is, 2006, probably 2010 or 2011 or something. Let's see, control end, 2010. But because it's got this enrollment number in there, it really throws that number off into the realm of meaningless. It's the total number of crimes reported plus the enrollment figure for each year for each school. So we'd like to kind of adjust that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to first start off by picking some one dimension to summarize this by. And so here, why don't I go ahead and summarize this by, let me summarize this by label, and I'll put that across the top of as my columns. So now, I've got to scroll up a little bit. So now this is actually giving me some useful data. So this says in this data set, I've got arson, there's 1,706 arsons, 6,500 assaults, 11,000 auto theft, and so forth. But of course, I'd like to do by more than one dimension. I've now summarized the data by one dimension. I'd like to give it another dimension. And so I'm going to go ahead and put the, why don't I put the state? I'll put the state here as a row field. That looks pretty good. And so now I can say, aha. Now, in this data set, for the state of Alabama, there's 2 arsons reported. There's 92 auto thefts reported in this data set. And these are crimes known to law enforcement that occurred on university and college campuses. Let's go ahead and do a filter here as well. Let's put report year as a filter. So I'll drag that down as a filter. And so now I can pick the report year. Right now it's saying all. I'm saying, no, I don't want all. I just want to see in 2010, what was it? We'll say OK. And now I'm only looking at the data for 2010. Of course, I can choose multiple years. If I want to see 2010 and 2011, or well, we'd have to bring more data in. But if I want to see 2010, 2009, I can come and select those two. They'll say OK. So now this is looking at the data for a 2-year period instead of a 1-year period. So, by the way, what's wrong with the enrollment number here? This enrollment number makes good sense when I'm on 1 year. What does that enrollment number mean? The number of students enrolled in that school during that year. But if I put 2 years in, what's the problem? Yeah, well, I'll have double counting, right? Unless we got rid of all the students that year and got all brand new students the next year, then we've got double counting. It's not the number of students anymore, but here it's a pretty good surrogate. So you always have to think about, anytime you've got a pivot table, you've got to think about really what's behind that number. And it's really easy to have a number that seems to make sense, but if you're not thinking back through where that number is coming from, you could be looking at data, making a bad decision based on the data. So this is pretty simple, straightforward pivot table so far. 2 dimensions with 1 filter. And it turns out we can be summarizing multiple numbers. Right now we only have 1 number, and there's only 1 number in this data set to summarize. But if I had other numbers here, I could put those here as well. So I could have multiple numbers in the intersection, not just a single cell. But now let's add some more levels in here. So let's do this. I'm going to add my type as a level to my columns. So I'm going to put that type here above the label. So now I've got all my crime statistics listed first, and if I scroll over a little bit, I should see my information statistic. There it is. So now that's nice because it gives me a subtotal just for crime and leaves enrollment then separate. And once I get that, that level in here, I should be able to filter on that as well. I can remember how to do it. Yeah, there's a way to do it. I don't remember how to do it. Maybe someone will remember and tell me how to do it. I think there's a way for me to tell it, and I don't want to see both of these. I only want to see crime, even though I haven't put a filter on. Select crime. Say it again. Select crime. In B3, I just barely updated my Excel from a 16-bit or a 32-bit to a 64-bit version of Excel, and some things are a little bit different. Are you seeing a way to make a filter on that really quick? I'm going to go to the Analyze tab. Ah, my field headers weren't showing. There we go. That looks better. Column labels. Ah, now I can say I only want to see crime. I don't want to see information. There we go. Ah, very good. You get a gold star for realizing it was the field headers that weren't showing. Thank you very much. And let's go ahead and do the same thing over here on row labels as well. I'm going to go ahead and bring campus in. No, let's bring school in as the next level. So now here's Alabama, but it breaks it down into the individual campuses. And then let's bring campus then even as another level below that, so that when we get to the University of Alabama, we've got 3 campuses and things show up and split out by campus, always summarized up, which always seemed to me a little bit weird and a little bit backwards. So Alabama then is split into everything that's below it. And then if we look at University of Alabama here, that number 1012 is the sum of the 3 that are below it. So it's a little bit weird because it sums up instead of summing down like we're used to seeing sums, but hey, that's the way it is. Okay, a couple other things let's take a look at before we start thinking about coding this. And that is, by default, when I bring all these levels in, they come in all expanded. And I'm probably more interested in having these come in collapsed to their level. And so I'm going to come here to Alabama. I'm going to right-click Alabama. And I'm going to choose Collapse, Expand Collapse, and then Collapse Entire Field. And so that should take me down just to those top-level summary numbers, but now give the user the ability to expand to peek down into this. I think I want to do the same thing for the campus as well. So I'm going to choose the college name. I'm going to choose Expand Collapse. And I will collapse that one as well. Do I have to get them all? Because I'd like them all to be collapsed. Maybe I didn't say collapse entire column. Collapse entire field. That looks better. Okay, good. So now when I come to University of Alaska, there's something to expand out there and so forth. Okay, so now that's a pretty useful tool in this context. It's got the data organized in a way that I could present that to a user, and then they could summarize it. Now, it might be very nice for me to be able to automate this process, especially if this data is coming in from some kind of external location, and I've got some process that brings this data in, it gets all the current data, shows it, and then instead of just turning that loose to my user and saying, hey, good luck, go build a pivot table, to build a pivot table, and although he or she might want to change it, I could at least get it there in the first place for them to start with. So that's kind of the goal for today. Now understand what happens in the background working with pivot tables through VBA. So let's go ahead and try to now record ourselves building a pivot table that looks pretty much just like this one. Shall we do it? If there's anyone here who knows any reason why we should not do this, speak now or forever hold your peace. Reason? Off we go. I'm going to go ahead and delete this sheet so I don't get confused about which one I'm working on. And we'll record. So we'll hit record and start again. So record is going to call macro 1. That's a great name. I love it. We'll say OK. And let's just go through that process again. Should I go through slower than I did last time? Because now you're trying to follow along with me? Or was that speed about right? About right? All right, so I'm selected somewhere in the data. I'm going to choose Insert Pivot Table. So up here, Insert tab, Pivot Table tool. And I'm just going to accept the defaults, which is the default range here, plus put it onto a new sheet. And we're recording, all this great stuff. I'm going to bring my value down as the value. For the filter, I'm going to put report year. Let's see, so for my columns, I'm going to put my type as the first level, and then below that, I'm going to add my label. And I think I'm going to go ahead and uncheck enrollment, because this is mostly going to be looking at crime. So for column labels, I will go ahead and unselect information. So we're only seeing the crimes here. Now I'm going to bring in state, school, and campus as rows in that order. And then I'm going to right-click on University of Alabama here and expand collapse the entire field. I'll do the same thing at the state level. Any of the states will do. Expand collapse entire field. So let's try that again. Apparently I expanded the entire field. So I'm going to choose one of the colleges. I'll have all this extra code now. Darn it, that's okay. Collapse entire field, and then a state. Collapse entire field. And hey, since we're here in Utah, why don't we go ahead and come and expand Utah then separately. And now we can see Brigham Young University and compare them to all of our competitors here in the state. And the one thing I've always found interesting is the one major that we fare really well on is arson. Oh, arson is the very first column. So Utah, BYU, we have, look at this. We're the only ones with arson in the whole state. And we got 5 of them in the data set. It's like a great family home evening activity, I guess, or something. Okay, so we got that expanded out. Was there anything else that we wanted to do? Oh, yeah, why don't we go ahead and apply a filter. Let's just put this on for this filter for 1 year. We'll do 2010, just the most recent data. I'm wondering if those arsons are in 2010. Oh, we only had 1 in 2010. It's an underperforming year. Oh, hey, yeah. It's an average year. Average year. Okay. All right, let's stop recording and let's go take a gander at the code. Here we are. So university crime data, modules, module 1. It's delightful. And there's macro 1. Let's see what we got. Whew. As is common with the macro recorder, we could do better. In fact, we will do better. Let's just take a look. So it starts off by saying we're going to select, that's kind of a really bad range. That's like B, 23,000. That must, what did I go to the very last? There's probably some data set down there because there's 23,000 rows. That's probably about right for this data set. I happen to select that cell. We added a sheet, and then here's where we get down to business. Active workbook. So it's a method of the workbook called pivot caches. Oh, so that's a, what do you think that is? Object, collection, method, what do you like? Yeah, it's like a collection. I've got to think of all the pivot cache. That's interesting. And then we're going to create. Okay, so what are we creating here? We're calling the create method of a pivot cache collection. We're creating a pivot cache. And it gives us all this then default information here. And then it does something strange. That looks pretty good. We're creating a pivot cache, but then it says dot create pivot table. What's going on there? Somebody enlighten me, help me understand what is going on. How can I say create a pivot cache and then dot something else? Why does that work? It works. Why does it work? Go ahead. Oh, okay, yeah. So that's right. So the comment was that there's the pivot cache is totally different from pivot table. Pivot cache is non-visual. It's in the background. It's got the data organized. And it's really important to have because we don't just build pivot tables on Excel data. We build pivot tables on external data as well, like from a database. And so what a pivot cache is going to do is it's going to say, hey, get the data here organized in a way that we can build pivot tables off of it. And if that data is external, it's critical because we don't want to have to go and go back to that external data every time we manipulate the pivot table. We want that data to be cached. That's what that is. But the question is, how can I say, call this create method, which is clearly a method, and then from that, say dot create pivot table? How? Oh, how? Something magical has to be happening. What is it? Okay, so in this one line of code, we've got two things being created at once, but the magical part here is that when the create method of the pivot cache is executed, it's returning a reference to something. What's it returning a reference to? If you had to guess, what's it returning a reference to? Not the data, to the pivot cache it just created. So here's a create method. It builds a pivot cache in memory. And then after it does that, it returns, it sends back, says, hey, here's the address where I built it. It's a reference to the object. And so up to this point right here, the code evaluates to the object that just got created. And a pivot cache has a method called what? Create pivot table. Yeah, so this whole thing evaluates to a particular object. We just barely made it. But because the create method returns a reference to the pivot cache it created, I can kind of change these things together. We're going to undo that. That's more than we want to accomplish in one line. Oh, I had to break it into 3 different lines, for crying out loud. But let's look at one other thing here. Now you'll notice that this create method is creating a pivot cache. This create method is creating a pivot table. Big difference here. This one's got parentheses around the argument list. This one has no parentheses around the argument list. What's going on? On one of them, I'm doing something with the value that it returns, right? I mean, here, this is creating a pivot cache. I'm doing something with it. But what am I doing with a pivot table that gets created? Nothing. I'm not doing anything with return value, and so no parentheses. This would be a really great question for the midterm next year. Not, you guys didn't want it this year, but next year, maybe. We've got one statement where it's, one line where it's doing both here. Okay, so before we move on, let's just go ahead and try to break this down and make this a little bit more digestible. So I'm going to get rid of these comments, this, select that range, sheets add. I'll go ahead and leave that sheets add, but let's go ahead and we'll want a reference for that worksheet. So dim, let's see, instead of calling this macro 1, let's call this make pivot table. And let's declare a variable to hold a reference to that sheet that gets created. So let's dim s as a worksheet. All right, someone read my mind and tell me what I'm about to do right here. Set, I heard the first part of it, set. Keep it coming. Give me one letter at a time. S, correct, set S equal. Okay, yeah. So set S equal to this. So I still want to add a worksheet, but just like the create method of the pivot cache, the add method of the worksheets class returns a reference to what just got created. So I'm going to capture that reference here. And so now if I want to refer to that sheet, I don't have to know the name. I don't care about the name. And you'll notice that name's important. The name actually figures in down here. What do you think? Is next time this code runs, is it going to be called sheet 2 that got created? Not necessarily. It would be a really weird situation for it to be sheet 2. Again, it could. I'd have to close the workbook, open it up again, and then it could create another sheet 2. But in this session, it's not going to generate another sheet 2. So that's going to be important to us. So now let's also declare a couple other variables here. Let's declare a pivot cache as pivot cache. And let's declare a pivot PT as a pivot table. All right. So active workbook.pivotcaches.create. I like active workbook. It's not too bad here, but what would be a little bit better for us? If we're writing this code, this is going to work on the workbook that's holding the code. What's a better thing than active workbook here? Yeah, this workbook. Active workbook's a shortcut to whatever workbook it happens to be active. And if I got 2 workbooks open at the same time, I could get off. But since I'm saying, hey, I want this code to work on the pivot table that's holding, or on the workbook that's holding the code, let's use this workbook instead. This workbook.pivot table. Okay, that's great. Now, I only want to go up to the create pivot cache. So here's the pivot cache collection. Here's the create method. And then here, this dot afterwards is where we're moving on. So I'm going to move that down and out of the way there. We're still going to work with it. But now, let's go ahead and set our pivot cache object equal to this. So now we're creating a sheet. And now we are creating a pivot cache. That looks wonderful. And so now, before when we created the pivot cache, we just immediately created the pivot table, but now we have collected we've collected a reference to that pivot cache. So now let's come here and let's set pivot table equal to, now what am I going to put right here? Yeah, the pivot cache. So before it created the pivot cache and said, hey, whatever that pivot cache is, build the pivot table on it. Now we're saying, create the pivot cache. Let's get a reference to that, and then we'll use that reference to create the pivot table. I'm going to bring this up onto one line, and then I'm going to take your question. I'm ready for your question. If we're no longer doing something with what's coming back from this function, this create function, should we get rid of the parentheses? And the answer is yes, but we are doing something with the value that comes back from the create. What are we doing with it? We're assigning it to a variable. Yeah, so we're taking that and we're putting it into a variable, so the parentheses need to stay here. But now over here, we are doing the same thing, right? We are setting a pivot table object, another object variable, equal to the create pivot table method here. Now here's all the parameters. What do we have to do? Yeah, we're doing something with the result set. We're not doing a whole lot. We're just capturing the reference and putting it in a variable. But we will have to put parentheses around the argument list here as well. Let's see if I can get that all to fit on the screen. There we go. Okay, so hey, this is looking pretty good. We got a worksheet. We're making a pivot cache. Don't need that many lines in there. We've got a pivot table. Sheets, sheet2.select. What do you think? Oh, actually, we're not quite there yet. We're on this line, so do you think this line is necessary? Should we change it in any way? Yeah. One thing, immediately you might say, hey, anywhere we say sheet 2 in this code, we should change that to S. But I want you to think just a little bit more about that and say, why would we need this line at all? When I create a sheet, what sheet's going to be the active sheet? That's the one that's just created. I don't think this line is necessary at all. I'm going to get rid of it. I can select the sheet again if I need to for some reason. I don't think so. Okay, now let's just make sure we've gone through the arguments here. Let's see if this makes sense. So here I've got source type is going to be an Excel database. That just means the data is coming from Excel. Ooh, source data. Crime data, that looks pretty good. That's the name of my sheet. But now, what don't I like about this range? What's wrong with this range here? Yeah, if I bring in new data, if I bring in the 2011, 12, 13, 14 data, I don't want to have to come in my code. I'd rather have my code look at that and say, hey, however much data there is, build a pivot table on the data. All right, so now here's a problem. Problem is that this is a string. Whew. My guess, I'm not positive about this, but my guess is I could probably just give data source an actual reference to a range and probably take it. We could play with it. We know it works as a string. Why don't we do this then? Let's go ahead and just bring it in as a string. So I'm just going to backspace off the reference to the range, and then I will concatenate onto this. Now I got to get the string of all the data. How do I get that? Any thoughts? What method could I use to just figure out the whole set of contiguous data? It was on the midterm. Like 75% of you got it right. So I'm starting to think it was lucky guess. Current region, yeah. And of course, you remember things better than you can recognize things better than you can recall them. So the fact you couldn't bring it out of your memory, that's okay. Okay. So we got to pick a particular cell. So the worksheet's called crime data. Dot cells, we'll do range. What range should we start in? There's like hundreds of thousands to choose from, anywhere where the data currently is. My favorite, A1. It's right there. Dot current region. A1 dot CURENT REGION. There we go. Now, this is a reference to a range. I am trying to build a string here. So what, I got to do one more thing here. What is it? I can't just do the range. That is a complex object. That is an object with a whole bunch of cells built into it. I'm trying to build a string here. Dot address. Very good. I want the address of that range. And we'll build that onto crime data. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that we could get rid of the crime data here and actually just give it that range itself. We might play with that, later in life, like later today. Make sure that works. I'm pretty sure it would work. Okay. So I like that modification here as well. Now, so we set our pivot table equal to create pivot table, table destination. Again, we've got sheet 2 hard-coded in here. Let's go ahead and do this. Let's get rid of that, and let's just concatenate onto the front of that. How am I going to get to the name of the sheet? S.name. Again, that takes a string, but I think it would probably take a reference to that cell as well, so there could be other ways to do it as well. Oh, pivot table name. Pivot table 2. The truth is, I can't remember if that's going to be a problem or not. My hunch is it won't be a problem. I think if I try to create another pivot table, and there's already one named that way, I think it'll like increment the number or add like an underscore and the number after it. So I'm going to back this off and just call it pivot table. I think that'll be a great name for it. And we'll see what happens if we try to create 2. It could create a problem. If so, we'll fix it. I don't think it will. All right. Now it's selecting a particular cell. I guess I'm okay with that. I don't mind it selecting a particular cell. There, that's fine. All right. Let us simplify the code here. First of all, will this line work the way it is? No, because it's trying to find a pivot table called pivot table 2. And we're really sure now that it's not going to create a pivot table called pivot table 2. So what should we do? This is a question. Say it again. Okay, so the source was s.pt. That's a really good answer. So what that says is that hey, we have bound on a variable called pt onto that pivot table that got created. Here we are trying to refer to that pivot table that was just created. And so the answer that came from a student was s.pt. This is close, but it's not right. What's wrong? If I say s dot, what am I setting this next part up to be? S dot, S means this is an object. Is S an object? Yeah, it's a worksheet. It's a reference to a worksheet. That would be fine. It really is. I could say S dot and then put any valid property or method that comes after it. But is PT a property or method of the worksheet? It's not. It's just a variable by itself. It is a direct reference to that object. So I don't need the S dot at all. So just PT is enough to do it. So with our pivot table, we're going to do some things here. What are we doing here? I'm just going to go through these and make sure they make sense. Column grand equals true. Oh, I guess I could change that to false if I didn't want the grand total column or the grand column. Has auto format true. It all looks fine. Display error string. Display null string. Enable drill down. Enable drill down. Error string. Merge labels. I don't even know what most of these things do. Page field order 2. Page field wrap count 0. That one's got me a little bit concerned. Repeat items on each printed page. Holy cow. Did yours record with all of this? I don't remember seeing that before. I just turned 50. My mind's going. It's like this last week. Got to go schedule a prostate exam now. I'm 50. I half expected my wife to like have it scheduled for me on my, she's a nurse. So I thought, hey, happy birthday, you're going to the doctor. Okay. And with, we'll come back and take a closer look at these. This doesn't look like it's doing things just right, but I think that's going to be A-okay. Let's look at the next thing it's doing. With Active Sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2, pivot cache. Simplify. Help me simplify this. Yeah, PC. We're going to make this politically correct. PC. Works on Mac too, by the way. So PC or Mac. Okay, but just make sure we understand that. So this is the way the recorder got to the pivot cache that was just created. We captured the reference to that pivot cache, so we can just supply that object right in there. Oh yeah, thank you. PC. Refresh, on file, open. Hey, did any of you ever see those commercials for the Mac? Hi, I'm a Mac and I'm a PC. I thought, you know, my kids, that's a part of culture that my children missed. And so I went and looked them up on like YouTube to show them to them. Do you have any idea how many of those there are? There's a lot. There's like in the 60s or 70 of those that they made. That was so many. And that doesn't even count the ones that they made for Linux that were mocking those commercials. Those are in some cases even better. Okay. Refresh when the file opens. I guess not. Missing items limit, whatever that is, that sounds fine. All right, what else we got here? Active Sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2. Oh. And anywhere I see that, I'm just so happy I can just change that with what? What did I change this with? PT, that's a pivot table. So we're saying repeat all labels, whatever repeat labels is, that looks great. Again here, pivot table 2, let's change that to PT. Add data field. So here now, this is where we're actually putting the data field in. Active Sheet. I don't like Active Sheet. What do I like better? Oh, Active Sheet, pivot tables, PT. Yeah, that's actually a reference to the pivot table. So I'll change that to PT. Pivot fields value, sum of value. Oh, maybe I'll just change that text to be total. And it's going to be a sum. That looks great. Active Sheet pivot tables. Now, this is the report year. We're making this, so here what we're doing is we're modifying one of the pivot fields. Here, we added a pivot field, and what did we add? We added one of the pivot fields. We added it as a pivot field. We added it as a data field. Now here, we've got one of the pivot fields, and we're going to set this one as the filter. Now, we can simplify this set dramatically. So we have to tell it, give it its orientation. It's got to be a page field. That's what makes it a filter. But what position do you suppose it's going to be in if I don't tell it position 1? It's got to be in some position. And the recorder said, you just put this in the first position. Well, that was the only position it could possibly be in. And so I don't need that line. If I don't need this line, I probably also don't need the with and with, because now I'm only manipulating one property. Okay, so here's our pivot table. I'm going to get rid of everything back to and including the with. And I'm going to change that to PT. And report year, I'm going to bring up the dot orientation. And then we're done with the rest of that block. Looks like we can do this a bunch more times. What's that? Yeah, maybe we should do find and replace. We won't do find and replace because, that's like replacing my job. That's my job to show you this. PT. And I'll bring up the orientation and delete the rest of the... Now this one's going position 1. This next one's going in position 2. What do you think? It's going to go in position 2 anyway. If I just tell it to add it, I don't tell it where to add it, it's going to go at the end. So these are going to go right in order. So I'll simplify this one. PT. Bring up the orientation. Get rid of the rest. In fact, I'll get the next one going as well. Change this one to say PT. Making this one, wait a minute. Pivot tables better, you gotta think about this in a little bit. Oh, this is great. It's got a width, end width, with only one line inside of it. Yeah, so let's definitely get rid of the width and the end width on this one as well. So we're making something invisible. Another end width. I tried to do too much at once in the last one. Now I've got a width, active sheet, pivot tables. I'll change that to a PT. We're going to make it a row field. Don't have to worry about the position. Maybe I should copy and paste. Find inner place. We got the school. And we'll replace this one. That's what I get for making a really long pivot table. There's a lot of work to fix it up. Same thing here, PT. Whew. Okay, now we got something else. Variety is the spice of life. Yeah, let's put all these together in one block. Range A19.select. I wonder why I'm even selecting A19. A6 select A9.select. Oh, here's where I was collapsing. Yeah, okay. So we don't need to select them to be able to collapse. We can get rid of the selection part. Pivot table 2, that'll be PT. Oh, now here's the one where I kind of made some false starts. So let's just make sure I pay a little more close attention to this. So pivot table, pivot field school dot show detail equals false. That one looks right. And then this next one is where I said show, make it true. That's no good. So then I made it false again. Okay, so school show detail false, school show detail true. So that's no good. So now school show detail false. I've already got that. Question? He's up here. Let's take the question. So here's the question. Could we put all this in one block that says with pivot fields and then have my and then end with down here, and then in the middle of that just have all of these without having to repeat pivot, pt.pivot field, whatever? And the answer is no. I could say with PT, but what's on that width? Do I have any more widths here? No more widths. What's on that width is this has to be an object. This has to identify an individual object. So even though the code is the same up to here, or even up to here, I can't put that on the width because what comes after that width has to identify an object. So I could come back here with PT, but truth is I'm not a fan of the width statement anyway. So I'd prefer to get rid of it when I can. Okay, so now what is this? Active sheet, pivot tables, pivot field school, pivot items, show detail false. Okay, that one looks okay, so let's get our pivot table 2 set down to PT. And I can now bring that up onto one line reasonably. And we are showing detail for school. Okay, so here's where I think things went crazy. Pivot table school, I've already done that one, yeah? I think that one's already done. Yeah. So state, so here we go. So now that shows the school collapsed, and this shows collapsed for the campuses. So now we're collapsing the state. So we'll set this to PT. False active window, scroll down 22. We don't have to scroll down to make this work. We don't have to select. I think we're getting close now. We're getting very, very close. Pivot table 2. That's PT. State, pivot items, Utah. Show detail is true. Oh, so here's where we're actually showing Utah. And we scrolled down to -45. That's an interesting way to say scroll up, but that's how we say it. And report year, we cleared the filters. Filters are going to be cleared. I don't mind leaving that in there, so I'm going to leave that in there. But we are going to get down to pivot table, PT, and then we're putting on a particular year. This doesn't look too bad. I just dearly hope it works when you try to run it. We've changed a lot of code. And don't need to scroll down. Whew. You know, not to brag, but this code looks a lot better than it used to. I will go back to the end. Question here. So everything that we're adjusting with this PT, could we just say with PT and then just put those inside that? And the answer is yes. So here we've got with PT. All right, yeah. I don't think there's any reason that we can't move this, what we're adjusting, the pivot cache. I'll go ahead and do it. So I'm going to put this pivot cache up here even higher. So we've already built the pivot cache in the pivot table, so I'm going to adjust these two things in the pivot cache here. Truth is, those are probably the defaults. Even if I don't put that line in there, it'll probably come out exactly the same. Same thing here. These are probably all the defaults, but I'm going to leave it. But we could then move this end width to the end. And then we can get rid of all the PTs. Could we actually leave some of these PTs in here? Would that be okay? Yeah, it's totally fine to leave them in. But we could now get rid of these all. Whew. All right, where do you want me to show? Anywhere? Are we laying odds about whether this is going to work on the first shot or not? That's a whole lot of typing for this to work on the first shot. You're giving me 3 to 2 odds? Is that what that is?
So, on our skills, we have a pattern.
Oh, let's take a look. So this, what you're saying is that we might not need to do this. So what this is saying is that we're not showing the detail of the school field, but now we're saying, let's look at the school field. Let's look at one of the pivot items of the school field. And so we're showing, I think this is getting into the next level deep here. Truth is, I kind of expect that to say something about campus as a pivot field itself to collapse that one. Because here we're showing the orientation of the campus. It's parallel to school. It may just be a fact of the way that I selected it. So we may come back and play with that one after we see if this works. But let's actually see if this works before we go into forbidden paths and unknown territories. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and delete sheet 2. And I'm going to give it a shot. Run my code. Oh, crime data, dot range. So that's the name of the sheet, but it's just called data over here as the name, not called crime data. So I'm going to change that to data instead of crime data. Right, crime data is what's on the label. Data is just what's the actual code name of the sheet. And did I have that in more than one place? I guess that's the easiest way to find it is try it again. This right here, this is okay because this is referring to the name of the sheet and as part of the string. This is the name of the object. So that's okay. It looks like it ran. Let's see what it did. Yeah, it looks like it built a pivot table. I've got report year 210. Things are all collapsed the way I want them to be collapsed. That looks great. Utah should be open. It is down here. Wow. Let's say I'm not so interested in having the grand total column. I'm going to go see if I can get rid of that, because that looked like it was one of these here. Has column grand, I'm going to change that to false. And I'll run it again and see what we get. It's still there. Is it? Yeah. I'm not sure what that did. Check the bottom, make sure the total's still at the bottom. Oh no, it took the total off the bottom. So that got rid of the total, just not the one I was seeing it didn't get rid of. I wanted that total. So what's the other one? Column grand, is there a row grand? Row grand, that seems backwards to me. Oh no, because it's doing the grand total of the row, which it puts as a column. So I'll change that one to false, run it again. I am getting pivot tables galore. Crime total. Is that? Oh yeah. So there's a crime total and then there's a grand total. Oh, that's right, because I'm hiding one of these other ones. I'm hiding the, what was it? The information one. Yeah, so crime total should be there. So now, on the one I just generated, I'm missing the grand total because I told it not to show it. That looks great. All right, I do want to take the question up that was here earlier of the different approach to collapsing that one field. So let's come down here, say we've got a campus. Can't I just come here and say campus? And I don't have to come into this level detail here to say show detail false. I like that better. We're not showing state, school, or campus detail. Then we'll come in specifically and we'll expand Utah. So I'm going to go ahead and try that. We'll run it. Object defined error. Didn't like it. Do you think it's capital case sensitive? I'd be surprised, but let's give it a shot. Campus. Go ahead. You're saying just get rid of this line altogether. May be true. Let's take a look. So it ran, but what happens if I open up Alabama? Oh, yeah, you're right. So all I was trying to do is get University of Alabama to be collapsed when we got here. So that's already collapsed. I wonder if I just said collapse the state, if it would collapse everything below it. Easy enough to find out now. Nope, this one still comes up expanded. So looks like what I'm after is just like that. Let me go up a little higher. How much higher? Out here? Question is, can go back to the bottom? Yes. Gladly, since I don't have anything else to say today after this. We've got the example going. I'm not sure what else we could do. I think I used to take longer on this lecture because we used to take longer explaining what pivot tables were. So maybe it's time to build out the content of this lecture a little bit. But you'll be the beneficiaries in the meantime of me dismissing class a little bit early. Are there any other questions? Now that I've hinted at the specter of leaving class early, there will be no more questions. Are there any other questions? Okay, let's just review what I got to drag out for the next 22 minutes. Or no, it's only 17 minutes. So that's basically it. The big things here to realize is that there's a difference between the pivot cache and the pivot table. And then the code that it generates is pretty good if you've got an eye to say, okay, that's where it's identifying the pivot table. Let's modify the code so that it's getting to the actual reference to the pivot table that we just created. As with so many things, when Excel records the code, it records it in such a way that it can't ever play it back successfully because it embeds the name of the various things in there. Oh, but I would like to see how does it name these pivot tables. I probably have all kinds of pivot tables now. Looks like they're all named one. And that might be a problem if I try to have pivot table with a different name, like two pivot tables on the same sheet, which we could do. That might be how I extend this example, but I won't do it on your backs today. Anything else you want to see? Do dealing with pivot tables. Those of you, now that you're a little more skilled with pivot tables than my former students, my students of former years. Anything else you'd like to see how to do with code about a pivot table? Oh, could we do something with the formatting to make alternating colors? Do you know how to put alternating colors on it by itself? Is there a way to do it? How do you do it? We come over here, design. That's one of these choices here. Like that. That's not alternating colors. That's not alternating colors. Banded rows right there. Oh, look at that. There it is. Oh, yeah, that's totally easy. I don't know how to do it. Let's record ourselves doing it. Banded rows. Stop. We'll take a look. Stripes true. Pivot table. PT. Stripes true. I don't even need the PT anymore. So the answer is yes. And it looks like kind of anything else you want to do with it, record yourself doing it, and you'll be in good shape. All right, folks, thanks for coming. Class dismissed. Oh, yeah, class dismissed.